time to switch to English. Dear students, ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome here Professor William Newton. Let me say a few words about his academic biography, and then I would briefly introduce tonight's topic. Dr. William Newton is an associate professor of theology and faculty chair of the Austrian program of Franciscan University of Steubenville. From 2005 to 2012, he was assistant professor of theology at the International Theological Institute in Trumau near Vienna, Austria. He is an associate member of faculty of Merivale Institute in Birmingham, UK, and founding member of the Aquinas Institute of Ireland. Dr. Newton has his PhD from the John Paul II Institute in Australia, Master Licentiate in Theology from Leuven, Belgium, and Master of Theology Studies from the International Theological Institute. He has published in numerous journals, including the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, the New Oxford Review, Crisis Magazine, and so on. He's the author of the Introduction to Catholic Social Teaching, entitled A Civilization of Law, The Catholic Vision for Human Society, published by Gracewing in 2011. He's originally from England. He and his wife Claire have 6 children. I met Dr. Newton twice in Gaming, where he addressed lectures to Slovak students of Collegium of Anton Neuwirth. I and students found his lectures not only exceptionally analytically clear, but true and inspirational at the same time. That's why it's my pleasure that he was so kind and accepted to give the lecture concerning the legacy of John Paul II tonight. So this lecture is organized on the occasion of canonization of John Paul II, which will happen in 3 days on Sunday, April 27th, 2014. Dr. Newton will analyze in his lecture the important paragraphs from section 13 of encyclical Evangelium Vitae. In these passages, the Pope John Paul II asks what is the proper relationship between contraception and abortion. Does contraception lead to less abortion, or abortion and contraception are fruits of the same tree? Please join me in welcoming Dr. Newton.
Great, thank you very much. Very kind introduction. Something to live up to. Okay, so in preparation actually for the canonization of John Paul II, I allowed my 2 eldest children to watch one of the movies called Carol. I don't know if you've seen these movies. There's one set prior to John Paul II becoming Pope, and the word name Carol obviously because that's his Christian name. And there's another movie which is set after he becomes Pope. I don't know if they have hit the sort of DVD shops in Slovakia. But what's very particularly struck me about the second one, so this is the movie where it's following through his pontificate, is probably for dramatic effect. The filmmakers have focused very much on John Paul II's place in the downfall of communism. So you get him sort of set as a figure which stands against a certain culture, namely the culture which came out of communism. And you get sort of parts of the film where he goes to Poland and kind of wreaks havoc among the regime there because of his ability to reach the people and inspire them for a different vision of life. Now, of course, that makes good cinema, and it's in part true, of course, but I think there's another kind of cultural clash which I would say is more at the heart of John Paul II's pontificate, but it's much more difficult to put into cinema, so it's not so obviously developed within the film. And that's the clash of the culture of life and the culture of death. Because this theme runs clearly, if you have any familiarity with John Paul II's writings, this theme is a key theme. the call to build a culture of life, a call to stand up against the culture of death. And in a way, I think that his opposition to communism was only a kind of sideshow, I say, to his opposition to the culture of death. Because for him, the culture of death really was a culture which subordinated the good of the individual human person to the pursuit of the society economically or politically. And so I think his critique of communism would ultimately come down to saying it was a kind of flavor of the culture of death, in the sense that the individual really was squashed in the society, pursuing whatever it might be, material, prosperity, or political ends. So my first point then would be, I think that one of the key themes in his pontificate is this dichotomy, this struggle between the culture of life on the one side and the culture of death on the other. Now, a second key theme in JP2's pontificate is embodied in his theology of the body, one of the more famous aspects of his writings, theology of the body. And it's important to remember that theology of the body is ultimately nothing more than a commentary on Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. So for all the density of the text, theology of the body, it really is his position on contraception and his argument as to the moral wrongfulness of contraception. Sometimes that's forgotten, but that's really the cutting edge of the theology of the body. But then it seems perhaps you've got two kind of themes which at first sight might seem contradictory. On the one side, promotion of the culture of life, including obviously opposition to things like abortion, and on the other side, the opposition to contraception. Because it might seem that it's possible to mount a plausible argument where you say something like, well, surely making contraception more available in a society would be one way in which to reduce abortion. So does there seem to be a contradiction, therefore, in John Paul II, on the one hand, promoting a culture of life, on the other hand, being very clearly opposed to the practice of contraception? And as Uri pointed out, these two themes do come together at one important point in his encyclical Evangelium Vitae, the encyclical on the culture of life. Because there he says, let me quote it, he says, despite their differences in nature and moral gravity, contraception and abortion are often closely connected as fruits of the same tree. So he's very clearly saying, no, there is no contradiction between his position of promoting a culture of life and his implacable opposition to contraception. And I'm going to take as my task in the next 40 minutes to try and explain to you why he holds that position, why he sees contraception and the culture of death as fruits of the same tree. I'm going to try and follow his thought as closely as possible, but I'm going to have to interpolate or make certain interpretations at certain points. So I'll do my best to keep to his position, but in order to make it understandable, I have to make sometimes my own interpretation of it. Yeah? I'll try and be honest when I'm interpreting it. Just give me some. Okay. Now, I think the key thesis is this, the key point is this, that for John Paul II, contraception is a game changer. I don't know how common that phrase is in your English vocabulary, but it seems to be a word that's more commonly used in colloquial English, that something is a game changer. And for John Paul II, contraception is a game changer. Now, according to the new Oxford Dictionary, which of course must be the correct one to use because it's Oxford, this is a definition of game changer. It is an event, an idea, or a procedure that affects a significant shift in the current way of doing things or thinking about something. So a game changer, whatever that thing is either an event, an idea, or a procedure that does what? Well, it affects a significant shift in the current way of doing or thinking about something. And my reading of John Paul II on contraception would be precisely that contraception or contraceptive mentality, or when a culture accepts contraception as normal, as most of the cultures that we come from do, that affects within the culture a shift in thinking about certain things. And it's on account of that shift that the culture of life is harmed and the culture of death is promoted. And I would say people generally do understand the significance of contraception as something of great cultural significance. If you go out on the internet and you sort of Google something like 10 inventions which changed the world, I bet you, I won't bet you a lot, but I will bet you something, that you will find contraception in the list. Yeah? So one I was looking at the other day, 10 things which changed the world, 10 inventions. You get the wheel, you get the compass, the printing press, you get penicillin, you get contraception, you get the internet, and I can't remember what the others are, but you get the idea. So even secular culture, I think they understand that contraception, it seems a small issue in the corner, actually has had profound cultural knock-on effects. Now they would often, those lists, if you look at them, they'll think contraception has had a positive one. Obviously John Paul II thinks it's had a negative one. But at least they agree on this, that contraception is a game changer. And my talk now, I'm just going to structure in a very simple way. I'm going to try and explain, with the help of John Paul II, how contraception changes the game in 5 ways. Yeah? The first way is it changes our perception of sex. Second is it changes our perception of life. Third, of the person. 4, of science. And 5, of morality. Don't worry, I'll remind you about those. Yeah? But in these 5 critical areas, contraception affects a change in mentality. And any one of those would have a profound knock-on effect in a culture in regard to its attitude towards culture of life or the culture of death. Put together, it's a very, very powerful effect on the way that cultures think about existence. Yeah? Okay, so you okay with my plan? I'm going to go through these 5 now and just try and explain from the perspective of John Paul II how contraception has changed attitudes. So first, contraception changes a culture's view of sex. This, in a way, is the most simple, because all we have to note is that contraception tends to trivialize sex in a culture which accepts it. The reason being that contraception clearly takes out of the picture that thing which is most profound about sex, namely the ability to generate a new human person. So it makes it a less profound experience. And it becomes a little bit more like playing doubles tennis. You know, when you play doubles tennis, what counts is not really the partner, but how much fun you have when you're playing it. And contraceptive sex has a similar kind of dynamic to it. And the result is that people will have sex with others whom they have no intention of raising a child with. Yeah? Because it's not even in the picture. Of course, this therefore leads ultimately to not a decrease in number of unwanted pregnancies, but normally an increase in the number of unwanted pregnancies. Because, yeah, people are just engaging in that activity, which will always generate children in some cases, but with people they've no intention to raise children with. And this is what is actually called in economics and sociology the Peltzman effect. Samuel Peltzman was an economist from New York State University, I think, and he came up with the idea that actually often safety devices lead to more accidents. This is the Peltzman effect. He thought it was true of car safety. So he thought that if you made it law that you had to wear a seatbelt, more people would kill themselves in cars because they would drive more like Formula One racing drivers. Now, it doesn't seem to work with cars, but apparently it does work with ski helmets. Okay, now, I'm not telling you don't wear a ski helmet when you go skiing, okay? Don't quote me on that. But apparently, the wearing of ski helmets is positively related to critical accidents in skiing, precisely because once you put your helmet on, you think that you're a sort of Olympic skier and you do things which otherwise you wouldn't do. Now, the same thing happens with contraceptive sex, yeah? It actually, what it does is, it makes it seem less risky. It puts more people into the market and more unintended pregnancies. So, for example, this is very clearly documented with, especially in teenage pregnancy rates, that approaches to trying to reduce teenage pregnancy, projects which promote contraception in that age group tend to produce more unintended pregnancies than less. And actually, I'll give you a quote from a recent study by Yale University, a group of researchers looking exactly at this question in Yale University. They say, after studying projects aimed at trying to reduce teenage pregnancy rates with giving contraception, they conclude, our results suggest that increasing access to contraception may actually increase long-run pregnancy rates, even when short-run pregnancy rates fall. On the other hand, policies that decrease access to contraception and hence sexual activity may lower pregnancy rates in the long run. And they conclude, the reason being, should contraception become more available, those who switch from unprotected sex to protected sex will lower the teenage pregnancy rate, while those who move from abstaining to protected sex will increase teenage pregnancy rate due to contraceptive failure. So the point is simply, you throw contraception at society, you increase the number of people in the sex market, and it doesn't have any negative effect on the pregnancy rates. It actually, in these age groups at least, increases unwanted pregnancies, and hence the consequences are more abortions. So the first point, rather mundane, straightforward. The point is that contraception changes the attitude in a culture towards sex, trivializes it, and therefore makes people engage in intercourse with persons they're not going to bring children up with, increases the number of abortions. The second game-changing element is that contraception changes our view of life. Now, I don't know how many of you, I hope not many of you, have seen the Monty Python film, The Meaning of Life. I heartily do not recommend that you see it. But in a misspent youth, I did see it once. Monty Python, do you know Monty Python? This is this kind of quirky British set of comedians. Now, in The Meaning of Life, there's a scene where there's a Catholic dad who lives in a ghetto. And he sort of comes on stage, as it were, and behind him is a kind of old, sort of 19th century housing block. And out of every window, kids are kind of pouring out of the windows. There's kids everywhere, and they're all his kids, according to the story. And he starts singing a song. And the refrain of this song, I won't sing it, but I'll say it. I promised my wife I wouldn't sing it. The refrain of this song is that every sperm is sacred, every sperm is great. When one sperm is wasted, God gets quite irate. Okay, so this is the refrain, and it's a kind of course, it's a kind of a, we say, Mickey take. It's poking fun at Catholics, basically. Now, one way of taking that song, it's got utterly the wrong end of the stick. It's a wrong approach to the question at one level, because what it seems to be doing is equating contraception with abortion, because it's saying that every sperm is sacred. Now, of course, that's not true. Every human, every embryo is sacred, but not every sperm. So it's kind of subtly, at least, giving the idea that somehow Catholics think that contraception is a kind of homicide, just as they may argue that abortion is a kind of homicide. And this is clearly not true. They're different realities. And if you remember, when I was quoting John Paul II in Evangelium 13, he's very clear about this. Let me just read that again. He says, despite their difference of nature and moral gravity, contraception and abortion are fruits of the same tree. Despite their difference in moral character and in gravity, they are different It's not right to equate contraception as a kind of homicide. It's not. However, there's always a grain of truth in Monty Python's skits. And the grain of truth in this one is that in contraception there is embedded a deep anti-life mentality. It inculturates into a culture a certain nervousness about new life, a certain subtle negative attitude, you might say. And this, of course, is most clearly seen in something like so-called emergency contraception, the morning after pill or something like this, because in these type of technologies, there is no sort of distinction made at all between the contraceptive effect and the abortifacient or the abortive effect. So we see any culture which kind of accepts that type of technology, which is certainly accepted in the culture that I come from, has already blurred the distinction between contraception and abortion. It doesn't care about that distinction. And this is because the anti-life mentality in contraception has had its logical effect on the culture. It leads, as it were, seamlessly to the legalization of abortion and other anti-life practices like that. You'll also see the fact that if a culture legalizes contraception, it almost immediately legalizes abortion. There's very few countries which have held out more than about 10 years on this. The average, what I saw, it's more like a sort of scientific study, but I had a look at the data, and probably about 8 years separate in most countries legalization of contraception and legalization of abortion. Because the door is, as it were, unbarred, it's unlocked when contraception is legalized. Because I guess the analogy would be something like this. To say to people that it's okay to contracept but not okay to have an abortion has a kind of internal illogic sort of element to it. It's like saying to a child, okay, look, pneumonia is really bad. So when you go outside in the winter, keep your hat on, have a nice warm coat. Now, when they're playing and the hat gets knocked off and they catch pneumonia, then you say to them, I'm sorry, we're not going to have any antibiotics to deal with this. This would be insane, but it's the same dynamic that would go on with contraception. By contraception, you tell people pregnancy is something to be guarded against. Now, when some problem happens in all the fun of sex and the person gets pregnant, then you say to them, you can't deal with that situation. It's just a kind of illogical connection in people's minds, and they won't stand for that. So to allow one, to think you can allow in your culture contraception but not abortion is an internal illogical element to that, which I think will never work. The second thing about this contraception changing the view of life, John Paul II is very precise about this in Familias Consortio. He says that the role of the husband and wife is to be a minister of the transmission of human life, but not the arbiter, not the one who simply decides as a gatekeeper to life, yes, no. The role of the spouses is to be like a minister of a power that they've been given. Now, contraception enculturates into the minds of people that they really are the gatekeepers of life, that they and they alone decide when life shall be and when life shall not be. And once you put that idea into the minds of people, that they're not ministers of a power given to them by God, and in fact, even from philosophical reasons, I haven't really got time to go into it now, you have to factor God into the creation of a new human being, because there's a spiritual element to a human being which does not come from the parents. So human generation is always a collaborative process. It's never a process, of course it's collaborative between the man and the woman. What I mean is it's collaborative between them and God. But contraception makes us think that we alone are the gatekeepers of life. And then, of course, if then a pregnancy occurs which is unwanted, this mentality of being the gatekeeper of life is applied in a more drastic way to the unborn child. So in both these different ways, contraception, in the thought of John Paul II, radically changes our view towards human life. So 2 game changers down, 3 to go, doing okay. First, changes our view of sex. Second, changes our view of human life. The third one is that it changes our view of what a human person is. Now, I had a colleague some years back who told me a story that I think they were expecting their 5th child. I think it was the 5th child. And when they told their eldest son about this, he was really excited that they were going to have another child in the family. And he went off to school and he told all his friends about this. And they were also really excited, because kids normally are really excited when a baby's coming along. You know? And one of his friends, so my friend's son, goes to school, tells one of his buddies. That buddy goes home to his mum and says, oh, Dante's mum's having a baby. Can we have a baby? And the mum wasn't so impressed with that. And the mum explained to the child that no, they couldn't have a baby because she had had one of those operations you give to bunny rabbits in order to stop them having more babies. Okay, so that's how it was explained to the child. And it kind of came back through the loop. He told his son, who told my colleague. And, you know, we were discussing that, myself and my colleague. But it seemed very significant, something very significant about the response of that mum, that she said, no, we're not going to have another child because I've had one of those operations you give to bunny rabbits in order to stop it. Because this is another thing I think that contraception does. It blurs the distinction between humans and animals. Why? Because one of the most indicative, one of the most special features of a human being is his or her ability to control their sexuality. This is not possible in the animal kingdom. At home in England, I live on a farm, and I've noticed this of long studies over animals. They cannot control their sexuality. You know? But human beings can. And so among all the different aspects that we share with animals, actually this is rather a different one. If you read, for example, Carol Wojtyła's Love and Responsibility, this would be an absolutely key point, that human beings are able to control their sexuality through virtue in a way that animals are not. And therefore, when we go to schools, or when people go to schools, and they basically hand out pills and condoms to young guys and young girls, in my opinion, and I think it'd be the opinion of John Paul II, they are treating those young people like animals. Because those young people can, unlike animals, acquire virtue. They can acquire the virtue of chastity, virtue of justice, both very important in the use of our human sexuality. Animals can't do that. And contraception basically is to treat a human being in the same way as you treat an animal. And that's why that woman, that mum, she had it right in her mind. I mean, it was a strange thing and way to say to her child, but she said it right. There was something significant in what she said. The second way I think that contraception changes our view of the human person is a little bit more technical, but if you don't mind, if you give me 3 minutes of technical discussion, I will then sort of leave you alone for the rest of the evening. Is that okay? Yeah. Only because this point comes up several times in John Paul II, so it's just worth considering it. It clearly was a key thought of his. And this is that John Paul II claims that underlying contraceptive mentality is an anthropology, a vision of the human person, which is so-called Manichaean. Now, Manichaean is a philosophy from way back at the time of St. Augustine, which had a rather exaggerated distinction between the person and the body. So the body wasn't seen as a particularly important part of the person. So the spiritual dimension would be associated with the person, and the body was rather, of course, it somehow was connected with the person, but not in a very intimate way. Actually, Descartes kind of resurrected this in a certain way much later in the history of philosophy. And the idea here is John Paul II believed that contraception, at least implicitly, had this Manichaean anthropology. Why? Because he would say this: if you use contraception when you're seeking a personal, intimate relationship with somebody, then you are neutering or putting aside a very important element of the body, namely the fertility. Now that means that you think that you can gain a deep personal communion with another person without a significant element of the body. That can only mean that you think the body is not significantly part of the person. If you think that the body and the person are very, very closely related as realities, then in seeking a personal union, you will necessarily seek a full physical or bodily union. And of course, people are not going round like this. They're not going to the apotheca and saying, I need a pack of condoms because I'm a Manichaean. I mean, they're not thinking at that level. But he's pointing out that an attitude pro-contraceptive actually has underneath it a rather strange view of the distinction between the person and the body. Okay, so what? Well, so what is this? If you think that the person and the body are not particularly intimately united, you can also think that there is a human body present without a human person present. And that's more or less the mentality which fuels a lot of abortion. Because one says, yes, there may well be a body of human type inside the woman, but that does not mean there is a human person inside the woman. Yeah? So an unconscious separation of body and person which takes place in contraceptive mentality has an insidious knock-on effect when it comes to the attitude towards unborn human life. Yeah? Okay, so both of those are elements under this idea that contraception is a game changer at the way it affects our attitude towards the human person. Okay, fourth, contraception changes our view towards science. Actually, in the theology of the body, this is a very key element. It's not overt, it's not very overt, it's not so much at the surface, but if you carefully read the theology of the body, this is deep down in it. So it's this, that contraception changes, subtly but importantly, our view of the role of science. Now, to explain that, I need to take a step back. C.S. Lewis, the English author C.S. Lewis, are you sort of familiar with C.S. Lewis? Yeah. He was very interested in the relationship of science and magic. So this appears at least in two of his works. It appears in one of his very philosophical works, which is The Abolition of Man, which is really, one should definitely read that in one's life at some time. It's mercifully short. It's like 70 pages, which all books should be, no more than 70 pages. Abolition of Man, he deals with the question of the relationship of science and magic, among other topics, at a very sort of formal level. It also appears in The Magician's Nephew. I don't know if anyone's read The Magician's Nephew. This is part of the Narnia Chronicles. Yeah? They didn't make this one into a film yet, and I please God they won't, because they'll trash it, I'm sure. But in The Magician's Nephew, there is a figure called Uncle Andrew. And Uncle Andrew is a kind of amateur magician. And actually, it's his fault that the White Witch ever sort of comes back into life. So if that means anything to you, I don't know. But there's a nice, neat part in this story right at the beginning when Uncle Andrew, who is utterly unscrupulous, he will do anything to get his way, explains to his nephew, who's a little boy, why defrauding people, cheating, disregarding what is good and true is okay if you're a magician. Yeah? Let me read you something of that. He says this. I hope I highlighted it, otherwise we'll never find it. Here we go. Okay, so this is the magician, Uncle Andrew speaking to his nephew. He says, of course, you must understand that rules of that sort about honesty and doing what's right, however excellent they may be for little boys and servants and women, and even people in general, can't possibly be expected to apply to profound students and great thinkers and sages. No degree. Men like me, who possess hidden wisdom, are freed from the common rules, just as we are cut off from the common pleasures, as, my boy, is a high and lonely destiny. Okay? Now, the point here is that magic, according to Lewis, is the same as science in one respect, namely the desire to gain power over nature. Both science and magic want that end. They differ because magic does not care whether it does what is right or what it is wrong in order to gain that power. Okay, so they have a similarity in one respect and they are different in another respect. Now, in The Abolition of Man, and also I think in The Magician's Nephew, what Lewis points out is that some forms of modern science are blurring that distinction and are becoming more philosophically like magic because they no longer care whether something is right or wrong. They care only that it is possible. And this is the problem which is called scientism. Anyone who is interested in the thought of Benedict XVI and Ratzinger will see this again and again in his writings. He talks about this problem of scientism, that science invites us now only to consider what is possible, not what is right and what is wrong. And in The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis gives several examples where he thinks that the distinction between magic and science, meaning one which cares what is right and wrong, one which doesn't, have blurred. And surprisingly enough, one of the examples he gives is contraception. This is C.S. Lewis, yeah? This is not John Paul II. In The Abolition of Man, he thinks contraception is one scientific invention which no longer cares whether something is right or wrong, only considers what is possible. And that thought is definitely echoed by JP2 in The Theology of the Body. It might be interesting to actually compare, therefore, contraception at this level with penicillin. I said that both of them were in the, this list of 10 great things. In fact, the contraceptive pill and penicillin were invented within 5 years of each other. Contraceptive pill 5 years before penicillin, interestingly enough. Didn't know that. It was in the 30s. And you see, from a point of view of John Paul II, these two are utterly different realities. One is truly science, one is more scientism. Why? Because penicillin heals what is sick in a person, where contraception destroys what is healthy in a person. Yeah? Because the whole point of contraception is to neuter something which is healthy. You don't want it to work. Where penicillin, something's not working and you want to make it work. Yeah? So though they might seem at one sight very similar, actually they are completely divergent when you consider them from the point of view of this distinction that Lewis is trying to make between science and magic, or we might say scientism. Okay, so good. That's four out of my 5. I always lose track of time when I'm talking, as my wife tells me. How are we doing? We're okay. So what do we had? Game changers. We had the game changer changes view of sex. Game changer changes view of life. Game changer changes view of the person. Game changer changes view of science. Of course, not the only thing which changes view of science, but it somehow has an important place in that changing view of science. The fifth is it changes our view of morality, or you might say it alters our moral compass. It's a little bit like placing a magnet next to a compass. You know, if you place a magnet near a compass, it sort of skews the compass and the compass doesn't work properly. Now, in order to see why contraception, among some other things, would change our general moral outlook, I again have to consider 2 points and then put them together. The first point is that the virtues, all the virtues are connected, such that if you don't have one virtue, in fact, you don't properly have another of the virtues. You know there's 4 cardinal virtues: justice, prudence, fortitude, and temperance. St. Thomas Aquinas, for example, says they grow like the fingers on a hand. So, you know, you never, when your hand grows from a child to an adult, you don't sort of suddenly have a massively long middle finger and a tiny finger here, yeah? They grow proportionately. The virtues are like that because if you don't have one growing, the others won't grow because they're interconnected. Now, the important thing to note here is that St. Thomas also argues that prudence is the most important of the virtues, because prudence is seeing the moral world as it really is. The prudent person is able to see morality and the moral landscape really as it is. And St. Thomas argues that the thing which destroys prudence among all possible things is covetousness, is intemperance. So being covetous is the thing that makes you morally stupid. I call this the Gollum effect, because in the story of the Lord of the Rings, if you know the Lord of the Rings or the Hobbit, you have this character called Gollum. Yeah? You know Gollum? Yeah? Gollum becomes utterly insane. Why? Because he's utterly covetous of the ring. Yeah? Now, Tolkien was much more sophisticated than C.S. Lewis in linking up metaphysical and ethical realities with his story. I mean, they're both brilliant, but Tolkien was much more meticulous about this. And in Gollum, you have this Thomistic principle that the virtues are interconnected. It's because he's utterly covetous of a ring that 2 things happen. One, he kills his kinsman. He's unjust because he's intemperate. Yeah, he kills Deagle. You know, Deagle is his mate who finds the ring, and he wants the ring. Gollum wants the ring so much he actually kills his kinsman in order to get it. This is intemperance leading to injustice. Yeah, the connection of the virtues. But more importantly, Gollum becomes insane. He can't see reality as it really is because he's obsessed by having the ring. Now, I think Tolkien is, you know, there may be other things going on there, but at least it's a wonderful image of this truth, that anything which makes us intemperate actually radically distorts our ability to see morality clearly. Okay, point 1. Point 2, I'm going to put them together. Point 2 is the main critique of contraception in the theology of the body is that contraception leads to concupiscence. It leads to sexual lust, sexual intemperance. Now, I just think this is true because sexuality is, among all the realities of human existence, particularly damaged by the fall, by original sin. And if you do not do something in your sexual life, I'm not talking necessarily about active sexual life, but in your sexuality, if you do not do something to fight against sexual selfishness, you will be sexually selfish. It's not a kind of level playing field here. You have to do something positively against sexual selfishness, not to be sexually selfish. This is true of married persons, even good marriages. Something has to be done. And John Paul II's concern, mapped out very, very meticulously in the theology of the body, is that contraception undermines that struggle, radically undermines the struggle which is utterly needed to build sexual selflessness. Yeah? It undermines the struggle for sexual selflessness. Hence, we've got 2 points here. One is, intemperance is the thing which changes our moral outlook more than anything else, and contraception builds into our sexuality intemperance. And therefore, I would just conclude that cultures which are sexually impure, sexually degraded, of which I have to say contraception is one element, simply will have a different moral outlook than cultures which are pure. I just think that in impure societies, people simply cannot see why you have a problem with abortion. It's not that they have a bad will, they simply cannot see the reality as you see the reality. Yeah? You have completely different outlooks. And this occurs at different levels. For example, another thing which intemperance leads to is the inability to see beauty. If you are intemperate, you always want to consume things. But beauty can only be appreciated as something that I'm not going to consume. Yeah? It's something which is wonderful for its own sake, not because of my consumption of it. So again, in cultures which are intemperate, and I'm arguing that contraception is one among various elements which build intemperance into cultures, beauty is much harder to see, including the beauty of human life, including the beauty of unborn human life. It's just not seeable in the same way. And finally, we even know that our Lord said to us, "Blessed are the pure in heart, they shall see God." That intemperate or impure cultures cannot see God, and therefore they're not going to see the image of God in other people, especially other hidden people, namely unborn children. So notice, however, I'm only taking contraception here as one element of intemperance or impurity in a culture. There are others. For example, widespread use of pornography is another thing which builds deeply into cultures intemperance, which will lead to a completely different moral outlook, which will lead to an outlook which is pro-culture of death. So I'm not picking on contraception, as it were, to the exclusion of other realities. There are other realities like pornography, which in my mind are also things which foster the culture of death. And of course there's materialism. So materialism, the desire for, excessive desire for material gain, also builds intemperance into people's lives and leads, I think, to the culture of death. The particular thing with contraception and pornography is that they touch upon human sexuality, and therefore they lead to us objectifying another human person. You know, it's different to just think of a car lustfully, you know, new Mercedes, new whatever it might be. It's even worse to think of another human being lustfully, because you make them just another object. And if you do that, of course, it's very, very hard, if you build sexual selfishness into sexual intercourse, to then be selfless when a child comes along is that much harder. Okay, so they're really my 5 points in terms of being a game changer. Changing view to sex, changing view to life, to the human person, to science, and to affecting our moral compass. Now, I've been trying to explain, therefore, how, for John Paul II, contraception is not an immoral solution to abortion. It is no solution to abortion. Yeah? I haven't really, if you think about it, I haven't really touched on the question of the immorality of contraception. I focused more on what are the psychological effects of contraception into a culture. So I really think he thinks that. It's not even a practical solution which is immoral. It's simply not a practical solution because it entrenches into the culture anti-life and therefore pro-culture of death attitude. There are other connections which I didn't make, which would be more, you might say, demographic. For example, cultures which are high use of contraception tend to have very low birth rates, which lead to top-heavy populations, which lead to a push for euthanasia. So there's other things you can add, but I think for John Paul II, the more critical thing is the way it changes the psychology of cultures in a way that promotes the culture of death. So, for example, if you could summarize it something like this, that a tablet of LSD might change your outlook for an evening, but a culture which swallows the contraceptive pill has its outlook changed for a whole generation. Perhaps I could finish by saying this, that I would make one correction, dare I, to what John Paul II says. He said, we saw in Evangelium Vitae 13, that contraception and abortion are fruits of the same tree. I don't think this is true precisely. I would say the relationship is not of two fruits, but of root to branch. That contraception is more like the root of the tree of the culture of death. It's not so much a fruit, because so many of the problems of the culture of death are rooted in that psychological cultural change which comes about with the acceptance of contraception. Therefore, from a pro-life perspective, I mean, I'm not assuming you're pro-life or not, I don't know, but from a pro-life perspective, I really think that there is no solution to the culture of death until, dare I say, the axe is laid to the root, because the root of the problem is much deeper, much more subtle, and in a way much more hidden. Now, we know, of course, that JP2 is going to be canonized, raised to the altar in a few days, and there's no doubt that one could summarize his whole pontificate as him being an apostle of life. But of course he was also, I think, an apostle of mercy. Among all the things that characterize his pontificate, he himself has said that the devotion of the divine mercy is utterly central to it. And he's going to be canonized on the Feast of the Divine Mercy. Yeah? He promoted the Feast of the Divine Mercy, and he died on the eve of the Feast of Divine Mercy. So none of this which he says, I wouldn't like to take the impression that what he said is condemning of people. It is straight and plain talking about a difficult truth. But John Paul II always approached these things in a very merciful way. He wrote an encyclical on mercy called Dives in Misericordia, which actually was an encyclical about God the Father. And so, to my mind, it's interesting that he connects there the idea of mercy and the idea of fatherhood. I think that's right, yeah? I think if you're a father, somehow mercy must be deep in you. But mercy has two aspects in fatherhood, in my opinion. There's two elements of being a good father. I'm not speaking from experience here, but it's more observation. The first is, yeah, you have to accept that your children are weak and they make mistakes and they make bad choices. And that's part of, I think, the merciful approach that John Paul II had. But on the other hand, you have to accept that your children are not just fallen, they are redeemed. And therefore you have to call them higher. And John Paul II was determined to call everybody higher. And he was determined to call all of us to do what we can, with God's help, to build a culture of life and a culture of love. Thank you.
Oh, Dr. Newton, thank you for your wide-ranging talk on negative effects of contraception. Now I open discussion. Please, if you have questions, just raise your hands and our assistant will go with the microphone. Okay, thank you.
So I wonder what you would say to the argument that sexual abstinence might indeed be advisable to teenagers.
Might be
advisable.
Advisable.
Yes, but it's not so easy. That it requires a certain discipline. Mm-hmm. and that indeed, especially nowadays in our culture, we can't realistically expect most young people to practice it. And what would you say to an educational program which would strongly encourage young people to abstain, and which would tell them, but if you can't abstain, so you should at least use condom?
Yeah. I mean, I think I would approach all young people as I would approach my own children, in the sense of I want what's best for them, and I believe that they have the power to live in the way that's best for them. There is something utterly depressing about a contraceptive culture, precisely because it says that people cannot do what for generations everybody basically did. And I have to say that to my mind, accepting contraception isn't just a moral error, it's can I say, a dogmatic error. Why? Because it's to say that we are not redeemed. One of the key elements in the theology of the body is this idea called the redemption of the body. And it's in the second chapter of Theology of the Body. John Paul II goes into some detail as to how redemption won by Christ affects not only the human soul, but also the human body. Now, we have to believe that's true. It's actually a dogma of the church that our bodies will be raised. Yeah? So the kind of end game of the redemption of the body is certain, that the body will share in salvation. That's a key element of the Christian dogma. Yeah? However, John Paul II says this redemption of the body isn't just the resurrection of the body at the end of time. It occurs now. And by that he means that with the help of God, with grace, it is possible to live a profound and happy chastity, whether you're married or whether you're not married. And what I would reject is a kind of pessimism that says it's not possible to live that way. This is very discouraging. Yeah, it makes people lose courage. There's three, in the Theology of the Body, also John Paul II talks about three masters of suspicion. I don't know if people know the Theology of the Body well, but anyway, he says that in our recent history, there's three great masters of suspicion. These are Freud, Marx, and Nietzsche. Yeah? Because Freud is suspicious that we can do anything other than follow our libido, and Marx is suspicious that we can do anything but follow material gain, and Nietzsche is suspicious that we are motivated by anything but power. Yeah? And he asks, John Paul II asks, is Jesus a master of suspicion? Is he suspicious about the human heart? Because he says, if you even look at a woman lustfully, you've committed adultery. Is he condemning the human heart? Is he suspicious of it? It's corrupt. Nothing can change in that heart. And of course, the answer is no. He's not among the masters of suspicion. He knows there's a corruption there, but because the body shares in redemption, we are able to live differently. And so I just wouldn't advise anybody to put themselves in the camp of the masters of suspicion. I would say put yourself in the camp of the Lord. Is it easy? No. Should we be merciful with people who don't succeed? Yes. But in theology, in the Families Consortio, John Paul II makes a clear distinction between so-called the law of gradualness and the gradualness of the law. Okay? He makes a distinction between the law of gradualness. Gradual is to do something step by step. Yeah? So the law of gradualness and gradualness of the law. And he says there is no gradualness of the law, meaning there's no gradations in the law. There's not kind of Premier Division Catholics and then First Division, Second, Fourth, Fifth. Yeah? The standard is the same for everyone, and it's high. Let's admit it, it's high. But there may be a law of gradualness that people have to go in stages to get to live that way. But to ever say to them that actually you're not made to live the highest way, you're only made to live down here, I think is kind of an insult to people. And so I just wouldn't go down the avenue of saying, well, if you can't be good, put a condom on. I just think you depress and discourage young people. Yeah? Sorry, that's a long answer to a short question, but that's my habit, sorry.
I'm going to actually build on the last question.
Yeah.
My question would be, or inquiry, how do you actually fight like sexual selfishness or even against culture of death? Considering, for example, do we fight from the most visible points backwards, going to the roots, or do we actually fight radically from the roots? Let's say, do we fight from abortion backwards, like it was actually accepted in society, or do we fight radically from the start, from the roots, and we have to actually explain to people, which is, I'm going to be pessimistic, kind of impossible to explain.
Yeah, okay. I think, I mean, I don't have an easy answer to that, but I mean, my sense is that you do what is possible for you to do. Everybody is called to build the culture of life, but it's different if you're in bed with terminal cancer, or if you're a young person who can go and pray outside abortion clinics. These are two different ways of fighting the culture of death, in the sense of one, you're offering your sufferings and your prayers, in the other, you're offering your energies. And you can't simply say it's got to be this way or that way. It totally comes to the circumstances that God has placed you in. So for me, what is my contribution? Okay, lecturing sometimes, but it's probably more profound in the way I try to bring up my children. Yeah, this would be one of the key areas that young couples need to be convinced that the culture of life is the culture of joy and live it in their families. And if every Catholic couple did that, the culture would be changed radically. It may take a generation, it's not a quick fix, but so the roots, yeah. But if you've got some influence in politics, or you've got the possibility to write a letter to try and influence a politician, of course, then you must do it. But my talk is based more on the idea that the culture of death has certain fruits, but it has a certain root, and that the root is really impurity, of which contraception is one element that JP2 sort of highlighted. Now, contraception is this strange reality that it's like a linchpin. Now, a linchpin is a tiny part of a machine, but if you take that little pin out, the whole machine kind of collapses. Yeah. So sometimes you can have very seemingly insignificant things which have a very, very big impact on a bigger organism. And I think contraception in the view of John Paul II is one of those. I mean, otherwise, to be honest with you, he spoke too much about it. If it doesn't have a significance beyond its just limited morality, he spoke too much about it. I mean, the Theology Body is a whopping great big book. It's 600 pages. He spent 4 years at the beginning of his pontificate every single Wednesday teaching about this. Now, he's either insane, or he sees the importance of what otherwise seems to be a tiny thing for the whole vision of human life, and therefore he goes directly to this little thing. So that would be basically saying, I think normally go to the root is the best, but of course if you got a chance to stop some of the fruits of the culture of death, then you also should do what you can.
Some other questions? In the back, please.
I have a question. When talking to young people about chastity, would you mention the faith, or would you just try to explain everything from the psychological point of view? And is it actually possible to live out chastity without believing in God? Those are kind of two questions.
So I missed that last bit. Without building?
Without believing in God, without...
Okay. Well, let me go for the last one first. Chastity is a natural virtue. So just like justice, is it possible to be just without God? Is it possible to be courageous without God? Is it possible to be temperate without God? I don't see that they are different questions, and I would answer yes to all of them. However, I do believe that without the help of grace, it's very hard to avoid some serious compromising in temperance, in courage, in justice, and in prudence. So, yes, without God, things are much more difficult, but I don't see why it's necessarily more difficult, all things being level, than being just, being courageous, being prudent, yeah, being temperate. It's natural. How would I explain it without God? Well, again, if it's a natural virtue, it must be explainable. And it seems to me it's explainable in the theology of the body, for example, is not really a religious argument at all. Well, I mean, there are some religious roots to it, but it's the argument of us having a vocation to make a gift of oneself to another person. And I think John Paul II is able to tap into that truth, which is very, very central in the human heart. That if you can get people to see that that is really what they want to do ultimately with their whole life, they will judge their life as a success or a failure as to whether they really made a gift of themselves to another and realized communion with another. Then this would be a good starting point to say that's why, for example, contraception is wrong, that's why masturbation is wrong. These things are not contributing to that deep, deep vocation which you can tap into. But everything is easier with God. Yeah? And what I wouldn't say take God. Why take God out the picture? Because people are worried that people won't accept God. Yeah, but at the end of their whole life is going to be that much harder if they don't accept God. So I wouldn't necessarily divorce them, but there may be situations where you feel more prudent to not go with a religious argument.
I would like to ask about contraception in marriage, if it is wrong or not, because if we assume that the two people love each other and they want to spend the whole life together, they respect each other and they want to have children in the future, but they don't have conditions for that right now, is it bad for them to use contraception or not?
I just missed one part. You said if that married couple don't have what at the moment?
Right conditions, like for
example, conditions.
Like
Yeah, conditions. Yeah, sorry. Well, I mean, if contraception is wrong, it must be wrong inside marriage because fornication is wrong. So fornication with condoms doesn't make fornication right. So at least the Catholic Church's position is not aimed at questions of condoms other than, or contraception other than within marriage. This is the direct focus of it, because obviously the Christian tradition is very clear that the only conditions for sexual intercourse is marriage. So obviously the Church's position and the Christian traditional position is not contraception is wrong outside of marriage, but it's okay in marriage, because I mean outside of marriage sex is wrong, according to the tradition. So whatever the teaching is, it's clearly focused on the question of marriage, and that's definitely the way that John Paul II is dealing with it in something like Theology of the Body. And the points are then just the same. If you have to fight, which I think, to be honest with you, unless you have the sanctity of the Blessed Virgin Mary, we're all fallen, and therefore our sexuality is fallen. Something has to be done in order to love through our sexuality, to really harness sexual desire for higher forms of love. You have to acquire the virtue of chastity. And contraception takes out of the picture the whole idea of self-control, and it makes it that much harder to acquire chastity and therefore to profoundly love another person in sexual intercourse. That would be one argument. The second is simply to do with respecting our sexuality the way that it's been created, and this is an argument which brings in God, though not revelation, just brings in the fact there is a God which can be known by reason, that human sexuality is made for two purposes, procreation and union. It has a twofold purpose. And just as it would be wrong to use sex in a way which damages union between persons, it's also wrong to use it in a way that damages its procreative dimension. So, yes, it applies to married persons, and I would encourage all married persons to seriously consider the effect that contraception has upon their relationship, has on their ability to love each other through sexual intercourse. And the best marriages that I know clearly have steered clear of contraception. If one feels one can't have children at a certain time, of course, then one can abstain from sexual intercourse. There's no compulsion to have sexual intercourse. So it's not wrong to plan having children, but it's, according to John Paul II, damaging to do that, damaging to marriages, damaging to relationships to do that through the use of contraception.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you have comments on it, say, I mean, you know, don't take my word as the last word. Nobody else does, so.
So maybe this is opportunity for me to raise question. What would you say that if we ban contraception now, if we stop contraception now in a contraceptive society, would it lead to more abortion? And if yes, at least in short term, would you accept this negative side effect of this ban of contraception?
Yeah, I mean, hypothetically, I don't know what it would. I don't know what it would do because, I mean, as I said, the main drive, the main reason that contraception contributes to abortions is because it trivializes sex. If people really, you really banned it, so no contraception was not available, or hypothetically, let's say somehow miraculously every form of contraception failed now forever for the next 5 years, people would simply rearrange their sexual lives in the light of that. But even if that wasn't the case, I mean, you simply cannot accept a bad means to a good end. It never works. I mean, it's immoral to do that, but it just never works for the best for people. So, in fact, the data is mostly that contraception increases abortion, but it's more of a problem that it ingrains abortion culture into society and also other things as well. For example, like euthanasia, it's going to be a push for euthanasia. For example, because if contraception blurs the distinction between animals and human beings, then of course, just as you put your dog down when he's suffering, you're going to put Granny down when she's suffering. So there are other implications. In Russia, the situation was that modern forms of contraception actually reduced abortions from an astronomically high rate, about 8 times the rate in Russia than they were in most parts of Western Europe, at least. But it comes to a plateau where it then just kind of continues on at a very, very high level. In countries that don't have an abortion culture and they introduce contraception, it always increases the abortions and contributes to an abortion culture. So while there may be situations where you could apply aggressively contraception to a culture, I mean, for example, you could make it by law necessary that all 14 to 21-year-old women were chemically sterilized. Could do that, yeah? Yes, it would clip some excesses on abortion, but it would just utterly ingrain the whole attitude of abortion, and along with that, embryo destruction, along with that, euthanasia into the culture. So I've argued that it's not even a practical solution. even if it were a practical solution, it would be an immoral practical solution, and you should never go down that avenue. I mean, you just open up a can of worms for all sorts of other unpleasant activities in society.
Between natural family planning and contraception is very thin border, and many people think the natural family planning is the other form of contraception. Could you explain the difference between natural family planning and contraception, and the conditions which is necessary for the moral use of natural family planning? Thank you.
Okay, yeah. Okay, good question, yeah. I mean, so the question is about natural family planning. I mean, isn't that just like contraception? Doesn't it have the same, we could put it this way, doesn't it have the same effect on the culture of death? Now, immediately you can see the difference here because, for example, the second game-changing element that I mentioned was that contraception has inbuilt a kind of anti-life mentality, which necessarily spills over into abortion and other kinds of culture of death activity. This is just not the case when people use natural family planning. They retain a fundamental openness to the goodness of life. So you can see that it wouldn't change the game in the same way as contraception would change the game. Again, I said contraception tends to build into sexual relationships sexual selfishness, or at least undermines the project of gaining sexual self-control. Natural family planning doesn't do that precisely because it requires people, if they want to avoid pregnancy, to abstain at certain periods, which is the only way to gain temperance in anything, food, drink, sex, is to have some kind of abstinence involved in it. So again, it wouldn't build into the culture sexual selfishness, and therefore won't have the ramifications which contraception has. So I haven't gone through all these 5 game changes and see, well, look, this is how contraception works. In contrast, this is how natural family planning works. But I've given you 2 of the game changers where you see that contraception does have a certain game-changing element, natural family planning doesn't have it. Now, so the differences are quite wide. Let me just say one or two things about that. One thing is that natural family planning does respect the inbuilt purposes of sex. Obviously, it respects the union, and it also respects the procreation. So when the couple engage in intercourse, they have no obligation to engage in intercourse ever. But when they do engage in intercourse, they still respect the unitive dimension of it and the procreative dimension. This is not true with contraception. It does build chastity, as I said, yeah, because of the abstinence, where contraception doesn't. Can you use natural family planning in a contraceptive way? Possibly, but I'm cautious with that because I think it would be more like this, that there's 2 virtues at stake when husbands and wives figure out their sexual relationships. One virtue is chastity, and the other virtue is justice. Justice because they have they owe each other, and they owe God, and they owe their children, and they owe society that they use their power to procreate in a reasonable way. Yeah? So for example, sometimes you owe your children to have another child. You could really owe them that. And therefore, your power to generate is not only yours. Yeah? And you might owe it to God to have another child, because it's the only way that immortal souls are created. So immediately you see that you don't have this gift as your own kind of gift, purely. There's something of justice involved in this, and this is what we mean by responsible parenthood. So justice on the one side, chastity on the other. A couple who use natural family planning to permanently avoid having children, in my mind, could contravene or go against justice, but they still don't go against chastity. Because what they do is not unchaste. They still have to abstain. They still have to have self-control. But maybe they're not using their power to generate generously enough. So I would therefore don't like to use the term contraception for couples who use natural family planning in a selfish manner, because I still think there's a kind of different structure to what's going on there. They are equally maybe not living up to the responsible parenthood and the virtue of justice, but I don't think they're being unchaste. Now, as to the reasons, all the church says is that you've got to have good or non-trivial, serious enough reasons to seek to not to have another child. And I wouldn't be too, I would be kind of fairly, what's the word? I wouldn't be too strict on that. If somebody asked me, I would say as long as there's really not a trivial reason not to have another child, then it may be okay to seek to not have another child. For example, you don't think you can adequately educate the children you've got. It would put a lot of psychological stress on the mum or the dad. These are not trivial reasons, but if the reasons are because I can't live a kind of flashy lifestyle if I have another child, then this is a trivial reason, yeah? But it's down to the couple, clearly. It's not for others from the outside to say, you're not doing that right, you're not doing that, you're not doing that. I think we should encourage people to have children, because while it's a lot of hard work in the initial stages, man, it's just the best thing in the world at the latter stages. Yeah, I never met somebody who said, oh, when they get to sort of 50, they regret having 5 kids. I never met anyone who regretted that. Of course, when they're all young, you can see the mum looks a bit haggard, and hopefully the dad looks haggard as well because he's helping the mum. But do you mean, in the long run, the benefits are so fantastic. I think we should encourage people, not criticize them if they don't, encourage them if they can and do. Yeah.
I'm sorry to say that time for discussion is over. If you have more questions, then please ask them personally after the lecture. I'm sure that Dr. Newton will be willing to answer them. And now, thank you, Dr. Newton, for accepting invitation and for coming to our festival. I'm sure that your lecture wasn't just interpretation of Evangelium Vitae, but also very much deepened our knowledge of the effects of contraception. So thank you for coming.